Why not adjust something if you think it's not quite right?
24 years after the theatrical release of Alien, Fox asked Ridley Scott to cut together a new version of the film for the quadrilogy DVD box set. His intention when creating this director's cut was to give the fans a new experience with Alien. Scott maintains that the theatrical cut is the definitive version of the film, and so referring to Scott's recut as the director's cut does feel misleading. Scott himself has said, quote, "The traditional definition of the term director's cut suggests the restoration of a director's original vision, free of any creative limitations. It suggests that the filmmaker has finally overcome the interference of heavy-handed studio executives and that the film has been restored to its original, untampered form. Such is not the case with Alien: The Director's Cut. It's a completely different beast." Scott found that once he had added the various new scenes, the pacing of the film was, quote, "completely thrown off," which is interesting given that the total length of the new footage is only around 5 minutes, and so he decided to go in and recut multiple scenes to fix the pacing problems and bring the runtime back down. He subsequently removed around 6 minutes of footage, resulting in the director's cut, unusually, having a slightly shorter runtime than the theatrical cut.
The reason why it was taken out was basically about story dynamics, and there's a certain point when you have the story and therefore the dynamics, particularly on a film like this, which is fundamentally a thriller, really moving at the impetus it was going, you suddenly didn't want to have something or scene where it took a minute out or 2 minutes out to basically, work against that impetus. But it's quite interesting to revisit this after all these years, to see maybe I should have left it in.
Now, as I did with The Lord of the Rings, I am going to be ranking the scenes as they appear in the director's cut. This, in some cases, is going to feel counterintuitive because there are entire scenes that have been removed in the director's cut, and so if the missing scene is excellent, then the director's cut's version of that scene will be ranked low because it no longer exists. But anyway, it is time to delve into the mysteries of Ridley Scott's director's cut of Alien. The first change we get is a rather uneventful and unimpressive 2 seconds or so of Dallas entering Mother, get your mind out of the gutter. And I'm just going to play this footage for you now because it is so brief. This shot was removed in the director's cut.
Sometimes you look at these things and think, I want to cut.
There are a handful of changes like this one that Scott made because he wanted to tighten up the film so as to avoid any perception that the film is needlessly slow.
Some of my colleagues at that particular time, including the studio, where they kept saying, but nothing happens for 45 minutes. And I said, well, that's the whole point, because once it starts to happen, whilst nothing happens in the first 45 minutes, it's revealing the world that these workers in space function in.
And rather amusingly, that was an excerpt from the DVD commentary track that he recorded in 1999, just 4 years prior to his creation of the director's cut. So, at some point during those 4 years, Ridley Scott would seemingly change his mind.
Oh no!
The cost of removing a whole load of small moments like this is something that is very difficult to quantify, and that is tone and atmosphere. These lengthy tracking shots help to build a sense of isolation and detachment, which, once we get further into the film in particular, are very deliberate and very effective. These shots are not slow for the sake of being slow. They are purposeful and suspenseful, something that is often lost in more recent horror movies, as they will make far too many quick cuts, which offers the audience an escape from what is on screen. This is one reason why one-shot sequences can be extremely effective. Notable examples of this would be things like Boiling Point, Adolescence, The Bear, Irreversible, 1917, but there are of course many others, because although these are not horror movies, they are still very intense and suspenseful, and they are unrelenting in how they depict this intensity. And the decision to convey this via very long, unbroken camera shots helps to plant the audience within the world of the film. Whenever you make an edit and you cut from one shot to another, You are breaking from one image and giving the audience something new to look at, which makes the audience go, oh, okay, now we're doing this. We are progressing the story. We are moving on to something new. Lingering for just that little bit longer on certain imagery can be particularly effective in horror movies because it can help to make the viewer very uncomfortable, dreading whatever is about to happen, and anticipating the next cut in the hope that it will alleviate the suspense. That is, however, not really the case with this 2-second shot of Dallas walking into a room. I don't particularly care about this change either way, and so it is going in C tier. After Dallas informs the crew of the distress beacon, Ash insists that their contract states that they must investigate it.
All right, we're going in.
Yeah, we're going in.
We then cut to the Nostromo approaching the planet. The director's cut inserts a brand new scene in which the crew listens to the distress beacon. Ripley observes that it doesn't sound like any radio signal she has ever heard. Dallas gives Lambert some coordinates so that she can pinpoint a location, and they figure out how far away they are, and that the planet's gravitational pull is similar to that of Earth's. This scene is quite long, and it doesn't add a huge amount. It allows Lambert to do her job as a navigator, and it shows the crew being appropriately cautious regarding the logistics of approaching this distress beacon. It also means the audience gets to hear the distress beacon, which helps to add a sense of unease as this noise doesn't really sound like anything, and the crew's response tells the audience, oh no, this is probably not good. However, I don't particularly like Ash's line,
"You can walk on it."
All right.
which comes immediately after Lambert says that gravity is at 0.86, because this feels like a modern screenwriting trope, where something is explained to the characters and the audience, and then one of the characters summarizes in idiot speak what has just been established. Parker and Brett are notably absent, which helps to draw a distinction between them and the other 5. Parker and Brett are engineers, they are earning less money than the others, and they appear to be of a lower socioeconomic class. Parker in particular had zero interest in investigating this signal unless he was paid extra to do so. And so it makes perfect sense for both Parker and Brett to be elsewhere, while the crew listens to the distress beacon and plans an approach to the planet. There is a clear sense of tension between Parker and Brett and the rest of the crew, and by keeping them out of this scene, this tension is maintained and arguably heightened in the director's cut. Overall, however, this scene is unnecessary. Everything that happens logistically is something that we can reasonably assume happened off-screen during their approach to LV-426. The scene is clunkily placed as it interrupts the very smooth narrative flow from the theatrical cut. In the director's cut, we get this dialogue.
All right, we're going in.
Yeah, we're going in.
And then, instead of cutting to them going in, we awkwardly cut to, okay everyone, let's take a listen to this distress beacon. The benefits of this scene are marginal, and overall I don't dislike it, so I am going to place it in C tier. The director's cut removes a back and forth between Ripley and Ash. After confronting Parker and Brett, Ripley returns to the bridge and begins working to decode the distress beacon, although the audience doesn't know that this is what she is doing until about 5 minutes later.
Well, it looks like a warning.
What a twist!
This is efficient because the audience doesn't strictly need to understand what Ripley is doing, only that she is doing something related to their mission. The theatrical cut, however, provides a small amount of setup in the form of dialogue between Ripley and Ash. Ripley asks Ash how Dallas, Kane, and Lambert are doing, and Ash replies that they are doing all right, but he does not elaborate. She then asks Ash if he has tried putting the transmission through ECIU so as to decipher its meaning. The film does not expand upon what exactly ECIU stands for or how it works. All we can infer is that it is a piece of software used for decoding radio signals or binary communications or something similar. Ash says that he hasn't tried this because Mother hasn't identified the transmission yet, presumably meaning that you need to isolate a signal from the transmission in order to run it through ECIU. Ripley then asks Ash if he minds her giving it a shot, and he replies, "Please do," before she sits down and we tie back in with the director's cut. This brief dialogue exchange seems superfluous, and I can see why Scott decided to remove it in the interest of speeding the film up, But there are some great little details here that play into our understanding of Ash. Interestingly, this is what Scott had to say about this brief exchange in the 1999 DVD commentary before he changed his mind and decided to remove it.
Clearly, we wanted to begin the tension between Sigourney and Ian. Even that exchange there's tension in it.
The way the movie fucks around with the character of Ash is something I may cover in a future video because it manages to walk a very fine line, concealing the fact that he is a goddamn robot, whilst also giving us multiple clues that something isn't right. As a reminder for anyone who hasn't watched Alien recently, Ash is operating under a special directive for the entire film, and whilst the film is not specific as to how much he knew, he, at a minimum, knew that the distress beacon was a warning, and that he had been placed on the Nostromo to recover whatever is on LV-426. In this scene, he initially tells Ripley, "Yeah, sorry, I can't do anything about decoding that distress beacon. The computer hasn't finished identifying it, so sorry, my hands are tied." Which may or may not be entirely true, but nonetheless, it does suggest quite subtly that Ash has something to hide. And this particularly comes across in Ian Holm's line delivery.
Mother hasn't identified it yet.
Liar!
Where he almost sounds as if he is making up an excuse on the fly. However, when Ripley asks him for permission to attempt to decode the transmission herself using ECIU, Ash doesn't say, no, wait, please, whatever you do, don't do that. He instead says, please do. This functions as a means of putting the audience's mind at ease on a subconscious level because it lends credibility to his earlier excuse. The reason this was removed in the director's cut was potentially because Scott believed that it presents a problem with Ash's plan. Simply put, if there was any possibility of Ripley being able to determine the true meaning of the distress beacon, then Ash would simply not allow her to try. In both versions of the film, by the time that Ripley has worked out that the transmission is a warning, Dallas, Kane, and Lambert are already too far from the ship for her to inform them. Which means Ash was very lucky that it took Ripley this long to translate it. However, I think this very brief conversation establishes, in a very subtle manner, two beats that are going to become very important later in the film. Ash is overly confident, and he underestimates Ripley. Ash was absolutely not expecting Ripley to decode anything useful, but she surprises him, forcing him to dissuade her from leaving the ship, and this also suggests that Ripley now has reason to distrust Ash. This is such a minor dialogue exchange, but I feel it only benefits the film. The director's cut is weaker for removing it, and so the director's cut's version of Proceeding Blindly is going in D tier. In the theatrical cut, Dallas, Kane, and Lambert spend a few more seconds entering the derelict ship. We then get an additional shot of Ash attempting to contact Dallas, and he is unsuccessful. This is arguably unnecessary, but it does show that Ash is repeatedly trying to communicate with Dallas, which serves a couple of purposes. He is heavily, we could say entirely, invested in discovering what is on that ship. And so, he needs to have open comms with Dallas, and additionally it helps to throw the audience off by further suggesting that Ash is just a regular crew member who is concerned for their safety. This is a tiny change that means very little, and so it is going in C tier. As Dallas, Kane, and Lambert enter the ship, the director's cut makes a bunch of cuts to various shots. The initial tracking shot of the wall of the ship, the crew walking around the fossilized space jockey, the shot focusing on the exploded ribcage, and the shot zooming in on the space jockey's face are all a few seconds shorter in the director's cut. It also entirely removes a shot of Kane beginning his examination of the space jockey. All of this totals about 15 seconds of removed footage in the director's cut. This is, again, very difficult to quantify, and I can't really look at each individual cut and say, well, this one is better because it objectively contains character development or setup for a later payoff or whatever. The difference between the two versions of this scene is entirely how it makes you feel. This is all about vibes. The director's cut feels far more driven and purposeful as it progresses the story with a slightly faster pace. However, by comparison, it often feels routine and controlled. as if it is more concerned with getting to the action quickly rather than slowly ramping up the horror and dread for what is inevitably coming. In particular, the slightly prolonged shots of the exploded ribcage, as well as the slow zoom on the space jockey's face, feel very unnerving, because the film is lingering on disturbing imagery in an uncomfortable manner. The longer shot showing the journey into the derelict ship also adds to the sense that they are truly venturing into the unknown. They have no idea what they are going to find, and there is no one around to help them if something goes wrong. For all these reasons, the director's cut is worse, and so the shortened version of A Word of Warning is going in D tier. As Kane investigates the egg, in the director's cut, he is armed with what appears to be some kind of gun, although this might just be a mining tool or a drill or something similar. But either way, he believes that he has a means of defending himself. This is very brief, but it shows some initiative as Kane is not blindly poking around an extraterrestrial egg to see what will happen. This also gives the audience a false sense of hope, as Kane is overpowered immediately despite the fact that he was armed, whilst in the theatrical cut, Kane is totally helpless. This is very minor because the facehugger attacks incredibly quickly, which means the gun wouldn't be of any use anyway, which means by the time the scene ends, it is clear to the audience that Kane was in fact completely helpless in both versions, regardless of the presence of the gun. However, the small adjustment to Kane's character, showing that he does actually take an admittedly small precaution when he realizes that there may be something inside the egg, I think is a clear improvement, and it only slows the film down by about 2 seconds, which means the changes made to Kane's descent are going in A tier. In the theatrical cut, as Dallas and Ash reveal the facehugger, Ripley approaches the infirmary and asks how Kane is doing. The director's cut, however, includes an excellent change that heightens the tensions between the crew, adds a bit of world building, and provides a payoff for an earlier piece of character work. Brett sees the facehugger and backs away. Parker is sitting down reading a magazine, evidently not particularly interested in whatever has happened to Kane. Given that he and Brett have been working flat out, or perhaps relatively flat out, trying to fix the ship since they landed, Parker is probably treating this as break time. Upon seeing Brett's alarmed reaction, however, Parker sits up and starts paying attention, asking how the hell Kane is still breathing. Brett nervously asks if Kane is even alive, and Parker then shouts, "Why don't you guys freeze him?" at Dallas and Ash, before repeating how come they don't freeze him to Brett and Lambert. Parker does raise this suggestion in the theatrical edition, slightly later into the scene, and so the only alteration here is that in the director's cut, Parker's immediate suggestion is to freeze Kane, rather than this being an idea that comes to him later. The director's cut therefore gives the clear impression that Parker is repeatedly, 4 times in total, offering what we can only assume is a perfectly valid suggestion for what they should do with Kane. But he is being ignored by Dallas and Ash. This also tells the audience that they do not have particularly advanced medical treatment available on the Nostromo, and that Parker's preference is to contain the problem until someone with adequate resources can properly fix it, which is entirely in line with Parker being an engineer. Then Ripley arrives at the infirmary, and it is notable in the director's cut that she isn't here already. Given the current emergency, Kane will have been taken immediately to the infirmary, and the fact that Ripley only arrives after Kane's helmet has been removed suggests a couple of things about her character. She has just been undermined by Ash. She attempted to follow protocol so as to mitigate any risk of contagion, and then Ash opened the door anyway and allowed Kane back onto the ship. Ripley may well have been considering staying away from the other crew members, Kane in particular, because she has no idea what has happened to him and she doesn't want to put herself in danger. But she then decides, actually, this is the situation we are now in, so I need to help my crew. But either way, Ripley climbs down the ladder demanding to know what the fuck is going on, and then Lambert bitch slaps her into next week for nearly leaving her locked outside of the ship on an alien planet next to a face-hugged Kane. This is an excellent character moment for Lambert that is entirely lost in the theatrical cut. because Lambert simply does not react to Ripley's presence when we would expect that she would. It is entirely understandable for Lambert to be very pissed off with Ripley, and the director's cut benefits from allowing her to confront Ripley in the way that she does. After Parker and Brett break up the fight, Dallas addresses Ripley from inside the infirmary, telling her that when he gives an order, he expects to be obeyed. And she replies,
"Even if it's against the law?"
You're goddamn right!
and then Parker, despite clearly disliking Ripley, as was made very clear in an earlier scene, decides to back her up, telling Dallas that maybe Ripley has a point because who the hell knows what that thing is. Dallas, again, ignores Parker, and we tie back in with the theatrical cut where he asks Ash how they are going to remove the facehugger from Kane. In the director's cut, the crew are not just dealing with an extraterrestrial creature that has attached itself to Kane's face. They are also dealing with the fact that Ripley is pissed off that Ash undermined her and broke quarantine. Lambert is pissed off that Ripley refused to let them in. Dallas is pissed off that Ripley didn't obey a direct order, and this is on top of the previously established tensions between Parker and Brett and the rest of the crew. This also means that when the crew is later forced to work together, they are doing so whilst harboring some resentment for each other, and so it is quite possible that this is the first time they have all worked together to achieve something. And because the crew of the Nostromo consists of competent adults, which is exactly what would be expected given the setting, Ripley doesn't at any point take the opportunity to remind Lambert and Dallas that actually she was right not to open the door. That no longer matters because they have bigger fish to fry. All of this is lost in the theatrical cut, and so, due to how this scene excellently builds and maintains a sense of unease and tension between the crew of the Nostromo, and the small but important character moments for Lambert and Parker in particular, it is going to land in A tier, and spoiler alert, this scene is the best part of the director's cut. In the director's cut, after confronting Ash about breaking quarantine, Ripley leaves the infirmary. Ash then removes his rubber gloves and drinks some milk that is almost certainly not milk, and then we cut to the next scene. The theatrical cut prolongs this very slightly. Ash removes his glove, slurps up some space milk, throws his gloves in the bin, and then leaves the infirmary, all of which takes about 15 seconds. This is the kind of thing that will have been removed for efficiency, but the purpose it serves is to linger somewhat uncomfortably on Ash after the scene has ended, with the presumed goal of making the audience subconsciously consider whether Ash is up to something. This happening at the end of what is probably Ash's most human scene, I think is no accident, because this serves as a way of getting the audience to let their guard down after Ash breaks quarantine, only for him to then defend his actions in an entirely human manner, because his argumentation is not founded in rationality, it is seemingly rooted in human emotions. This appears to alleviate any suspicion, but then the extra 15 seconds or so of Ash alone finishing up and leaving the infirmary was likely intended to make the audience go, wait a minute, I'm not sure if I like this guy, what is he up to? And if we fully consider what is actually happening here in its entirety, Ash was researching the facehugger, then Ripley shows up like, hey, let's have a chat about that whole breaking quarantine thing. Ash defends his actions, Ripley leaves, and then Ash packs up and leaves as well. Ash was not finished. Ripley interrupted him, and he then pretends that he was finishing up so as to throw her off, and then after she leaves, he can't really just turn the monitors back on and continue his work because this would be very suspicious. So Ash is likely pretty pissed off with Ripley for getting in his way and slowing him down, which then plays into a later scene between the two of them. Some of this may well be a stretch, as this footage is quite literally just 15 seconds of Ian Holm leaving a room, but in a film as rich with character as Alien, it is quite possible to draw rationalizations for including what would otherwise be considered pointless bloat. By removing 15 seconds of Ian Holm walking out of a room, the director's cut's trimmed version of standard procedure is going in D tier. In the director's cut, when Ripley confronts Dallas, he tells her that Ash gets to make the final call regarding what to do with the facehugger because them's the rules. Standard procedure is to do what the hell they tell you to do. Dallas then changes the subject and asks her how the repairs are going, and Ripley replies that Parker and Brett are pretty much finished. In the theatrical cut, Dallas does not change the subject, and Ripley instead presses him regarding her concerns over Ash. Ripley asks Dallas if he has ever shipped out with Ash before, and Dallas replies that he flew out 5 times previously with another science officer, and that the company replaced this science officer with Ash 2 days before they departed on this particular mission.
I don't trust him.
I don't trust anybody.
And he then asks Ripley about the repairs. I have no idea why Ridley Scott decided to remove this back and forth regarding Ash. Perhaps he figured it was already sufficiently clear that Ripley was suspicious of Ash, or maybe he didn't want to plant the question as to why Ash was a part of this crew in the first place. The issue is that by removing this conversation, it is unclear in the director's cut how long anyone has known anyone else. These are 7 people working on a ship together for long-haul missions through space, and we have no suggestion that any of them are new additions. And then suddenly, Ash is a goddamn robot.
What a twist!
This is surprising, because this had been expertly concealed whilst still offering hints for people who are paying attention, but we, as the audience, have no clue how exactly this happened, and so we can only assume that the company is in the habit of placing androids on mining ships in case they find spooky aliens. The theatrical cut, however, includes this dialogue in which Dallas tells Ripley explicitly that he does not know Ash. We can infer that no one else on the ship knows him either, and that the company assigned Ash to the Nostromo very shortly prior to their departure. The fact that Dallas does not question why the company would do such a thing is also entirely in character for him, as he is only interested in doing the job he has been given and not asking questions.
Standard procedure is to do what the hell they tell you to do.
Anyway, this means Ripley and the audience are beginning to have serious questions regarding Ash, and this is an important step leading up to the reveal that
Ash is a goddamn robot.
And so, by omitting this conversation, the director's cut's version of the missing guest is going in D tier. After Kane becomes a dad, both versions of the film give us a slow panning shot showing 3 separate corridors as the crew check for the alien briefly before Kane's funeral. This shot is longer in the theatrical cut, as the camera pans back to the left before we cut away. Ridley Scott has essentially removed about 14 seconds of the camera looking down corridors. Now, again, in a lesser movie than Alien, this might seem like something that could be removed without affecting anything. But this shot helps to disorient the audience and reinforce how much of a maze the Nostromo is. Additionally, this shot is possibly from the perspective of the alien, as the shot itself is not clearly focused on any particular character, and we can hear what sounds like a heartbeat throughout.
See anything?
Although part of the genius of Alien's sound design is that this could just be irrelevant ship noise that is designed to subconsciously trick the audience and make them afraid of nothing.
You can hear a lot of very subtle sounds all the time. They're always there. So they're working on your paranoia. And I think these atmospherics are terribly important. This is not score. This is just uneasy, almost organic sounds that make you feel uncomfortable.
Either way, this is 14 seconds of looking down corridors, and whilst there is already quite a lot of looking down corridors in Alien, this shot being slightly longer allows for the shock of the chest-bursting scene that immediately preceded it to settle in a bit more before the plot continues, so I do think the theatrical cut is better, but I also don't have particularly strong feelings on this one, so let's put the director's cut change in C tier. By now, you may have sensed a pattern. You will never guess what is different about this scene. Well, because the scene begins with Ripley, Parker, and Brett walking down a corridor, Ridley Scott decided to trim it because I guess the man really hates corridors now.
In terms of adjustments of story, etc., I went in, and after 25 years of occasionally looking at it, and particularly when you're looking at your regrading for DVD issue, I started to get kind of impatient with preambles, really. If, you know, the beginning of a scene, it would take so long to say, why didn't we move the goddamn camera? Why were we waiting 15 seconds before the move? And I think the idea was being in love with the set and being in love with the lighting process, so I never wanted to cut anything.
I'll keep this brief because it largely falls under points that I have already made. Taking this slow and showing the characters nervously entering the corridor ensures that we maintain as much suspense and claustrophobia as possible. We are not hurrying forwards to get to the scene where the alien starts eating people, even though those are the only bits the TikTok generation is interested in.
Why not adjust something if you think it's not quite right? I mean, after all, it's got to respond to now, today, and therefore if audiences are going to get impatient with the pacing of today, then they're going to lose interest.
But the thing with the TikTok generation is that they are not going to sit down and watch a 2-hour-long horror movie from 1979. They are going to watch the various scenes where the alien attacks people through TikTok, YouTube Shorts, or some other blight on storytelling. Which means Ridley Scott didn't actually need to trim any fat off the original. Then Ripley detects something using Ash's tracking device, and they approach a door that is partially open. She says that whatever they are detecting is within 5 meters. In the director's cut, they immediately open the door less than a second after Ripley finishes speaking, and we then watch them enter the room in a shot that lasts for 24 seconds before the camera cuts to a new angle. In the theatrical cut, they approach the door, pause, and we get to see the room they are about to enter before they open the door. The shot of them entering the room this time lasts for nearly twice as long, at 45 seconds, and quite amusingly, Ridley Scott seemed to be having second thoughts about the length of this scene when he recorded the 1999 DVD commentary before committing that, yes, the way he cut the film in 1979 was deliberately designed in this way, only to then change his mind and go on to make changes for the 2003 release.
Of course, when you've looked at this a few times, you start to think, maybe we should get there quicker. But now I haven't seen the film for a few years. I think it works.
The reason this scene is weaker when you start rushing things is that the characters know that there is something in that room, as it just showed up on the tracker. And so taking this slow is not only entirely in character for everyone present, but it is also superior in terms of tension and suspense, and so the director's cut's version of this scene is going in D tier. Next up is one of the weirdest changes Ridley Scott made when tweaking his film. For the most part, the footage he removed was uneventful but purposeful and effective shots that help to maintain suspense, whilst the footage he added was the occasional line of dialogue or conversation. In this instance, however, he decides to cut away from Brett, the character the sequence is focused on, to give us a shot of the alien that is just kind of there for some reason. This actually confused me when I first watched this movie when I was 14, because I was like, wait, is that the alien? Why is it just hanging around up there? Had this shot been included in the theatrical release from 1979, then maybe the effect would have been different. This would have been a seemingly random cut to an unknown and unmoving shape hanging from the ceiling, because audiences in 1979 didn't know what the alien looked like. Whereas by the time the director's cut was created, 24 years later, the audience will have been very aware of what the alien is and what it looks like. This means when a post-1979 audience watches the director's cut, that audience is going to recognize that this is obviously the alien. Scott pulls the same trick much later in the film, far more effectively, when the alien hides in the Narcissus and its head is disguised in amongst the structure of the ship. But here, the alien is not disguised, it's just kind of there. And I have no idea why you would ever include such a revealing shot of the thing, especially at this point in the movie. Throughout almost the entire film, we do not ever see the full extent of the alien. It is not until the very end that it becomes clear that this is a humanoid creature with a head, 2 legs, 2 arms, and a tail. For 99% of its screen time, we never get a full body shot of the creature. But in the director's cut, here's the alien in all its glory, barely an hour into the film. This cutaway also interrupts a 37-second long shot of Brett cooling down in the coolant, or whatever this rain is, and yeah, okay, fine, I get it. Conventional modern movie-making wisdom would likely decree that thou shalt not have a 37-second long shot of a guy doing basically nothing for no particular reason, but fuck that. This kind of thinking is why modern horror movies are instantly forgettable popcorn garbage.
Would I do this today? Not really. I'd still be going for the tension. I'd still be going for nothing happening. But I think it works pretty well.
Alien gets under your skin in a way few other horror movies do, and whilst, yeah, I can totally understand someone watching either cut of this movie and saying, I was bored. But all that means is that that person didn't get anything out of the experience. Speeding things up by a few minutes would almost certainly not have made that person enjoy the film, but it would absolutely make the film worse. So, this 37-second long shot of Brett exists because of 2 crucial aspects of horror, of which Alien is a masterclass. Tension and suspense, and dread, and horror. Okay, 4 things.
I mean, you gotta admit, Ridley is a master of atmosphere. And when it comes to texturing a scene, texture, mood, subtlety of mood and feeling and atmosphere, he really is superb. I mean, without it, it would have been a much lesser picture. When you're doing a scary movie, a horror story, a suspense movie, naturally plot is important, it's vital, but so is atmosphere. And a horror movie that is not atmospheric is not a pleasing thing to watch.
Brett is alone. Brett is not being particularly careful. Brett is impeding his own senses by closing his eyes and having a quick shower. We know that there is an alien creature somewhere on this ship, and we have no idea what it is capable of. This is not 37 seconds of a man standing there doing nothing. This is 37 seconds of something very bad is about to happen. Could this have been accomplished in 36 seconds? Sure, but this is where the subjectivity of editing comes in. You hold the shot until it feels right. What you do not fucking do is interrupt the shot with, hey guys, look, it's the alien.
It's very hard to talk about editing. That's why I say this is very difficult. But whenever I've talked about editing, it's people say, why did you do so-and-so? Yeah, I have to say it was instinctive. I did it because it felt right at the time. It's like if you're teaching somebody how to do something. You can't teach people how to edit. You can tell them what they can't or they shouldn't do. But then those rules are already there to be broken because we take tremendous gambles with editing. And I'm still, after all these years of doing it, endlessly surprised at what we can achieve with the same pieces of film played in different ways and tricked around. But saying why and how you do things, it's got to come down to the material you were given and obviously what you were trying to achieve. And then it's got to be an inbuilt thing. It's got to be your inner timing. And then, of course, that will work to a certain extent. And then your director will suggest changes which you never thought of. And I hope that's what I do for them.
The next change to this scene happens immediately after Brett is killed by the alien. In the theatrical cut, the camera holds on the cat for a few seconds, and then we cut to the following scene where Parker tells the others what happened. In the director's cut, Parker and Ripley show up and see that Brett has been taken. They enter the room as the alien escapes with Brett, and they shout up at him as Brett's blood begins to rain from above. This part I do actually like for a couple of reasons. It allows Parker to witness his friend being taken before being covered in his blood. This is quite effective visually, and it also marks a distinct change in Parker's character. a change that will persist for the rest of the film. It also provides clarity as to how exactly they discovered what happened to Brett. Parker and Ripley go on to explain to the others that the creature is huge, larger than a man, that it disappeared into the cooling ducts, that it is using the air vents to move around, and that they do not believe Brett could have survived. In the theatrical cut, it is not intuitive how they could know any of this, because the scene ended when Brett was attacked, and so it would not be reasonable to assume that Parker and Ripley were actually nearby and saw the whole thing. The director's cut, however, shows that they did witness the aftermath of the attack, and so it plugs the hole as to how exactly Parker and Ripley could possibly know any of what they just asserted. Out of curiosity, I checked the original script for the film, and it appears that the intention was always that Parker and Ripley did witness the attack, which obviously makes more sense than the alternative, and the reason why this is not what happens in the theatrical cut is because Ridley Scott thought that Brett's death scene would be more effective if he is alone.
We used to have Sigourney and Yaphet rush in, but somehow that was too normal. It was more elegant to leave him to die in a lonely fashion. The cat was the only witness.
This presents me with a problem when placing the scene on the tier list because the first part is garbage, but the second part is probably deserving of A tier. So because these are totally separate changes that are totally different in terms of their quality, I am going to cheat by cutting the scene in half. Here Jonesy 1 is going in garbage tier, and here Jonesy 2 is going in A tier. Also, Ridley Scott removed like a second of Brett's POV looking up at the chains for some reason. After discussing the plan to drive the alien through the air ducts and zap it into outer space, the theatrical cut gives us a scene of Dallas speaking with Mother, and this scene is completely absent in the director's cut. We begin with a relatively lengthy establishing shot of the Nostromo, before cutting to Dallas inside Mother, keep your mind out of the gutter, and he asks, request evaluation of current procedures to terminate alien, telling us that, despite Dallas's cool head and apparent confidence, he still has no idea what he is dealing with, and he is attempting to get some encouragement or advice from the ship's computer before he goes into the air vents. Mother replies, unable to compute, available data insufficient. Dallas asks, request options for possible procedure, and Mother again replies, unable to compute, available data insufficient. Dallas then finally asks as clearly as he can, in plain English unclouded by computer speak, what are my chances? Mother replies, does not compute. This is excellent, foreboding, horrifying, and scary as shit. Dallas is starting to unravel. The computer is seemingly unable to help him whatsoever, but in actuality, Mother has new orders. And where Dallas was praying for at least some comfort or encouragement in the form of the ship's computer approving or improving his plan, he gets nothing. He gets cold, unemotional detachment. He is already alone, and he is already totally fucked. Mother and Ash are operating under Special Order 937 to ensure the recovery of the alien life form, and so what appears on first viewing to be a computer being useless is actually far more sinister once the truth is revealed. This also tells us what Dallas's headspace is before he goes into the vents, whereas in the director's cut he just says, let's go into the vents, and then he goes into the vents. Additionally, after Dallas is attacked, Ripley tells Ash that now she has access to Mother, and so she will get her own answers. And by the time Ripley discovers Special Order 937, the audience has plenty of reason to suspect that some information is being withheld. In the director's cut, this is not the case, or at least it is far less clear that this is the case. Why, Ridley, would you ever remove this scene? The director's cut has earned another garbage tier change. The director's cut trims about 20 seconds of Dallas crawling through the vents. Ridley, stop removing the tension and suspense out of your movie. For the love of God, you had it right the first time. Garbage tier, stop ruining your movie. Not everything needs to happen as quickly as possible. Dallas in the vents is one of the best horror sequences ever filmed. You don't need to make it shorter to appeal to idiots with no attention span. After Dallas is attacked, everyone decides to continue with the original plan. The theatrical cut then shows Parker leaving to refuel the flamethrower. He is very on edge, and this is the first time we have seen him behave like this. He is terrified, and he fucking should be. And this brief shot of Parker nervously taking cover and building up the courage to simply walk into a room is excellent characterization because of how this dramatically contrasts with how Parker behaved previously. Once again, this shot is simply not in the director's cut, which means we have less characterization for Parker and a lesser sense of imminent and constant threat. And so the director's cut's version of this scene is going in garbage tier. In the director's cut, after leaving Mother, now aware of the truth, we cut to Ripley radioing Parker and Lambert. In the theatrical cut, we spend about 8 seconds watching a distraught Ripley leaving Mother and walking to the radio. This is another example of Ridley Scott seemingly trying to minimize any long camera takes, presumably because he believed that cutting more frequently would modernize the film. The theatrical cut allows the shock of what just happened to settle in a little before we advance the plot, but I can't say I have strong feelings on this one, so the shorter director's cut version is going to land in C tier. There is a tiny change during Crew Expendable, and I think this is straight up a bad edit in both versions of the film. Yes, Alien is about as close to a perfect movie as you can get, but this edit right here could easily have been masked by cutting to a reverse shot to cover up the transition between the dummy head and Ian Holmes' head. Anyway, Ripley spends an extra couple of seconds in the theatrical cut fiddling with Ash's head, trying to get it upright before we cut to Ian Holmes' head. Whereas the director's cut trims this by a couple of seconds, which makes it potentially easier to miss what is still a very obvious transition. I have a marginal preference for the director's cut's version of this scene, although, again, this could have easily been fixed entirely by cutting to a reverse shot of Ripley, Parker, or Lambert before cutting back to Ian Holm. As Ripley, Parker, and Lambert discuss blowing up the ship, we get a long shot leading them down a hallway that lasts for 45 seconds before they split up. The director's cut chops out the middle section of this shot, during which there was no dialogue, and so the camera movement where we change angles is replaced by a hard cut. There isn't as much of a case I can make for this being better in the theatrical cut, because unlike the shot of Parker earlier in the film, there isn't any clear characterization present during this 7 seconds or so of them walking down a corridor. All it accomplishes is that it adds a degree of realism to the ship they are in by showing the audience long, unbroken shots of the crew walking around it. I don't have strong feelings regarding either of these changes. The Ash cut doesn't really alter anything, and the corridor cut is more excusable than some of the previous ones, so I am going to place this change in C tier. In the director's cut, Ridley deleted a few seconds of Ripley preparing the Narcissus, consisting of her using a computer, followed by a wide shot of the ship. This is relatively inconsequential, but by speeding this up, he has drawn attention away from what is a fantastic subversion in the theatrical cut. The alien picked off Brett and Dallas when they were alone. After dealing with Ash, Ripley then goes off on her own, while Parker and Lambert gather supplies. And so the expectation is that Ripley is next. She even goes after Jones the cat, which is of course exactly how Brett died. This is something that can be difficult to truly appreciate, as we live in a world where Sigourney Weaver as Ellen Ripley is one of the most iconic characters in cinema, but if you eject any meta-knowledge from the sequels, at this point in the film, we don't really have a main character. Initially, the film suggests that Kane is the central character, as he is the first one to wake up, and he personally explores the derelict ship. Second to Kane, the expectation will be that Dallas is the central character. Dallas is the captain, and Dallas is the man primarily making decisions. If we add some meta-knowledge from the time, all 6 of the other actors were well over a decade into their careers by the time they did Alien, whereas Alien was Sigourney Weaver's first major role. She was essentially a nobody, and so there was no expectation that Ripley was going to be the sole survivor. All of this together means that when Ripley is like, you guys go off and grab some stuff, I'm going to stay here on my own, the audience, consciously or otherwise, will be expecting Ripley to be the alien's next target. The painfully slow process to ready the Narcissus is therefore very purposeful in achieving a sense of foreboding. This is something that happens to even greater effect with the self-destruct sequence later in the film. And by trimming this, Ridley has stripped away some of the impact. Audiences in 2003 obviously knew that Ripley wasn't going to die, so why bother wasting time baiting her death? Whilst I understand the decision to trim this, I completely disagree with it. We also, for some reason, cut about 3 seconds of Parker and Lambert gathering coolant. I don't know why, but I guess it was deemed too slow. But anyway, the changes made to the escape plan scene are going in D tier. In the theatrical cut, Ripley finds Parker and Lambert's bodies and sets the ship to self-destruct before heading to the Narcissus. She manages to get to the ship, but finds the alien blocking her way, and so has to backtrack so as to override the self-destruct sequence. She is unsuccessful, and is then forced to reattempt getting on board the Narcissus. She finds the alien is nowhere to be seen, and so she boards and escapes, seemingly leaving the alien behind. In amongst this, the director's cut includes a brand new scene, and this one is easily the most discussed change in this version of the film. After initiating the self-destruct sequence, Ripley climbs down a ladder and hears a noise nearby. She then discovers what is presumably secreted resin, as seen in Aliens, coating the walls of the room. And she finds Dallas alive, but not exactly in a good way, and Brett, who is very much dead and is being dissolved into goo, and presumably being turned into an egg. Dallas begs Ripley to kill him, and she torches the room before we tie back in with the theatrical cut, with Ripley emerging from a ladder. What does this scene accomplish in terms of world building? This reveals that the alien was not simply killing people to eat them. It was in fact reproducing. The alien is seemingly capable of turning human bodies into facehugger eggs, regardless of whether they are alive, as although Dallas's fate was ambiguous, Brett had a hole poked in his skull, so Brett was absolutely already dead before being turned into an egg. This is a pretty horrifying concept that gives the alien more autonomy and agency. It is not, as is suggested in Aliens, a mere drone in service of a queen. This helps give the sense that the alien is indeed the perfect organism, as in order to reproduce, all it needs to do is repurpose someone else's biological matter. This does quite clearly contradict the alien's life cycle that is expanded upon in Aliens, as James Cameron introduced a queen, which is where the eggs come from, and presumably he was not aware of this deleted scene from Alien, as this was not seen publicly until 17 years after Aliens was released. Or maybe Cameron was aware, but he didn't care, because the alien queen is a core component of Aliens for multiple reasons. We can try to weasel our way out of this apparent contradiction in how the alien reproduces by saying, well, if there is no queen nearby, then the alien will turn people into facehugger eggs, but this is far less intuitive than, for example, suggesting that aliens who live long enough will eventually become queens themselves and then be able to create more eggs. When Ridley Scott made this director's cut, Aliens, Alien 3, and Alien Resurrection had all been released, which means he had context for where other writers and directors were going to take this story. Although outside of this scene, there are no changes present in the director's cut that play into anything in the subsequent movies. It is very difficult to answer which version contradicts which, because Alien was released in 1979. James Cameron then expanded on the life cycle established in Alien by introducing the Queen in 1986. And then in 2003, Ridley Scott was like, actually no, and he restored a scene that had been removed from the 1979 film, and this scene simply doesn't fit with what James Cameron did with the Alien lore in 1986. My personal view is that the Queen has a much clearer sense of logic, and it feels more intuitive because of the analogies to real-life insects. but I also understand that part of the appeal of this scene is that this makes the alien's life cycle that much more, for lack of a better word, alien. Aside from the Queen contradictions, the emotional content of this scene does link in quite nicely with aliens, as Ripley will likely recognize the alien goop on the walls as the Marines enter the nest, and the colonist begging to be killed before being chest-bursted is also a repeat of what happens with Dallas in this scene, which serves as an additional layer to Ripley's nightmares about being chest-bursted herself, which are established in Aliens. However, there are 3 problems with this, starting with the least severe. Firstly, Ripley does not have time to deal with this. The ship is about to explode, she needs to get out right the fuck now. Secondly, Dallas is going to die anyway. Yes, he is clearly in pain from being turned into goo, but the ship is about to explode. So all Ripley accomplishes here is that Dallas dies about 5 minutes earlier than he otherwise would have, arguably through less compassionate means, as when the ship explodes he would die pretty much instantly, whereas Ripley torches him with a flamethrower. But most importantly, the problem with this scene is where it is placed. The final 20 minutes or so of Alien is one of the best sequences ever put to film. And I might make a video on it at some point in future. Please do let me know in the comments if you want to see that. And the director's cut doesn't quite ruin it, but it comes pretty close. This is a good scene. This is a very good scene. The problem is that it shits all over the pacing of Ripley's escape from the Nostromo.
You got 17 minutes of where everything's flying, and the dynamics are terrific. Everyone's dead, and Sigourney's on her own. And so the 17 minutes seemed to be great dynamics, and I went for that, and I tried that scene in and out and in and out, and I thought, well, it doesn't obstruct, it intrudes. And having looked at it recently, in the last year, I thought, oh, it actually works pretty well.
I am terribly sorry, Ridley, but I must again disagree with you. It absolutely distracts from the urgency of what is happening. It fills in gaps that don't need filling in, and it pivots out of unrelenting suspense and into the much slower and less intense but undeniably disturbing fate of Brett and Dallas before speeding back up again for the finale. For quality, this scene is an easy A tier, if not higher, but I'm sorry, the theatrical cut flows so much better by skipping this scene, and so I have to place Mercy in D tier. In the theatrical cut, Ripley pauses before making a run for it because she is fucking terrified, and she needs to psych herself up for what she is about to do. Surprise, surprise, in the director's cut, this momentary pause is gone. Ripley just climbs the ladder, grabs the cat, and starts running.
It's fantastic, you see, the time you take over everything. This is what makes this film so special.
After Ripley bumps into the alien, she drops Jones and runs away. When the alien investigates the cat, the shot in the theatrical cut is much more of a close-up, and it only lasts for a couple of seconds. In the director's cut, the shot is slightly further away, and the alien yeets the cat to the side when it is done sniffing around. The theatrical cut is again better, because the focus of this sequence should obviously be entirely on whether or not Ripley will survive. And whilst she cares about the cat, taking nearly 10 seconds to be like, oh no, is the cat going to be okay, is just a needless distraction. In the theatrical cut, the alien does still examine the cat, but this is not lingered on, and the purpose of this shot is to establish that Ripley, in a panic, has left the cat, and to show that the alien is not currently following her. Garbage tier. Stop it, Ridley. Ridley then continues to fuck around with perfection by removing over 15 seconds of Ripley climbing out of the ladder and beginning to run to the Narcissus, which, need I remind you, is exactly where the alien was last seen a couple of minutes earlier. It is very likely that she is about to encounter it again. In the director's cut, we cut from Ripley poking her head out of the ladder to the POV shot of her approaching the next room, which means we are no longer following Ripley every step of the way, we are now skipping time and montaging this shit.
I want to cut her.
which provides the audience with respite from the alien and a space for them to detach emotionally from what is going on. We are not locked in with Ripley in the director's cut because the film is not locked in with Ripley. The film is instead repeatedly skipping little bits in the name of getting her to the final showdown sooner rather than later. So, let's check in with 1999 DVD commentary Ridley to see what he has to say about this.
Now she's got to go all the way back. And they always wanted to cut this down, and I said no.
What the fuck?
Ridley also decided to, yet again, cut out the middle of a long tracking shot where we follow a character. He added an edit where an edit was not necessary, and the result is a janky-looking cut in the middle of a suspense sequence. The theatrical cut gives us a delightfully devilish, unbroken 42-second long shot as Ripley creeps agonizingly towards the place where she just encountered the alien. Yes, it is long. Yes, it is slow. But that is the fucking point.
It's fantastic. You see the time you take over everything.
There's always this sense that had I made it too slow, it isn't slow. I think it makes it more tense. You know, something always is going to happen.
Ripley is terrified. She can barely move, but she doesn't have a choice. Death is behind her as the ship is about to explode, and death is in front of her, with an added splash of unadulterated terror. In the director's cut, however, we jump forwards by about 10 seconds mid-shot, which accomplishes nothing other than getting Ripley to the Narcissus faster, which is a bad fucking idea that also looks like a balked edit where footage was unsubtly removed, because that is exactly what Ridley did. And finally, Ripley grabbing Jones is cut by about a second. Ripley using a computer is cut by about 2 seconds. Ripley putting on her seatbelt is cut by about a second. And so, the changes made to the Narcissus escape are also going in garbage tier. So that was a pretty effective demonstration of how making what are for the most part very minor cuts can have a severe impact on a film's pacing, tension, and suspense. There are a whole load of micro changes in film density that Ridley Scott made, and the 6 or so minutes of footage that he cut out for the director's cut is the kind of thing that may well not have been noticed by a casual viewer, and could therefore be considered justifiable to remove. But once you dig into the purpose behind these brief moments, or simply listen to Ridley Scott's 1999 self explaining his reasoning, it becomes clear that the director's cut of Alien, despite including a couple of decent new scenes, is an excellent example of the importance of editing. Despite the fact that I have been pretty harsh in this video, I want to make it clear that I only consider most of the changes to be bad in direct comparison with the theatrical cut. And if the director's cut were the only version of Alien that existed, the problems would be far harder to notice. This would instead be a case of dealing with final 1% stuff to get that little bit of extra characterization or tension or whatever. The director's cut of Alien is competing with a film that is about as close to perfection as is possible, and so any changes made need to be exceptionally well justified. And frankly, the director's cut feels like Ridley Scott was tasked with making a different cut for no particular artistic reason, and so he decided to add some shit and then cut out some other shit to make room for it. And the reason it feels like this is because this is pretty much what happened. Aside from the editing changes, the theatrical cut is much darker in many scenes, in particular the exterior shots showing the vastness of space. Given the subject matter, I think this darkness is entirely appropriate, even though it makes things harder to see, because this clearly adds to the horror of the setting. It is, however, possible that this was due to technological limitations back in 1979 that limited how much light could be present in certain scenes that were either matte paintings, model shots, or composited footage, and so maybe Scott always intended for the film to be brighter than it was. Regardless of whether or not this was a stylistic choice or a limitation, this is another area in which the theatrical cut surpasses the director's cut. Ridley Scott is the director who first comes to mind when discussing the concept of a director's cut. He has created many of varying quality, including Blade Runner, Legend, Gladiator, Black Hawk Down, Kingdom of Heaven, American Gangster, Robin Hood, The Counselor, The Martian, and Napoleon. In some cases, these are significant reinventions of the theatrical release, where, for whatever reason, Scott was unable to release the film in a manner he was happy with. In other cases, these are cash grabs, where Scott was asked, "Hey, you're the director's cut guy. Can you do a director's cut for this in exchange for your dignity and reputation?" Unfortunately, Alien: The Director's Cut is the latter. There is no reason for this to exist. And if it had instead been marketed as Alien: The Alternate Cut, or Alien: The TikTok Cut, then I honestly wouldn't care as much as I do. The problem I have with this is that calling this movie Alien: The Director's Cut is purposefully deceptive, because this is not a director's cut. Credit to Ridley Scott, he has not been secretive about this, and he has been open and honest as to why the film exists. Quote, "Upon viewing the proposed expanded version of the film, I felt that the cut was simply too long and the pacing completely thrown off. After all, I cut those scenes out for a reason back in 1979. However, in the interest of giving the fans a new experience with Alien, I figured there had to be an appropriate middle ground. I chose to go in and recut that proposed long version into a more streamlined and polished alternate version of the film. For marketing purposes, this version is being called the director's cut." It certainly takes some balls of adamantium to go back in and tweak a film that had been hailed as a genre-defining masterpiece for over 20 years, but Ridley Scott did exactly that, and he did it because he was not content with simply adding in a couple of scenes and calling it a day. If this was just a cash grab, then he would have done precisely that, and very few people would have complained about the film being 5 minutes longer. Ridley Scott seems to truly care about this alternate version of the film, and so in spite of the fact that it is obviously an inferior edit, it is difficult for me to hate it. However, if you have only seen the director's cut, because you mistakenly believed that the director's cut was the definitive and superior version of the film, then I implore you, watch the theatrical cut. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, I hope you have enjoyed. Please do consider dropping a like and/or subscribing, as it will help the channel out. I have plans to make a similar video for Aliens and possibly Alien 3, depending on whether there is much interest, and I have a few ideas for other extended versus theatrical videos that I may make in future. In the description, you will find links to my second channel where I upload video game streams, music, and some other oddball videos that do not belong on the main channel. You will also find links to the community Discord server, as well as my Patreon. But with that, this is Random signing off. See you next time.